two, one, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Real Time Talk with Quentin Anderson and Eagle 3D Streaming. Today we have Juliet Brown with us. Juliet's background is as a documentary filmmaker. She graduated in documentary direction from the National Film and Television School in 2011, and her work has documented people working through trauma in cases of genocide, ecocide, and gender dysphoria. Over the past 10 years, she has taught practice-based documentary courses at the UK's National Film and Television School and UCL. The Unreal Project is her first interactive documentary project. The Unreal piece, Take Me Home, presented on Eagle 3D's pixel streaming platform, is a prototype for an interactive documentary which is part of Juliet's PhD by film practice. Juliet, how are you doing today?
Hi, Quentin. Thanks so much for having me on. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be on this show. Your background is extremely interesting, so it may be helpful for all of us to maybe kind of hear how you got to where you are today.
Hi, yeah, sure. As you said, my background's in documentary filmmaking,
Hmm.
more in an observational filmmaking genre, and kind of fly on the wall documentaries. And I made a film back in about 2013, 2014 about the BP oil spill, and it was called Ecocide, and it was about the little island off the coast of Louisiana that was kind of ground zero for the oil spill.
Hmm.
And that project was pretty tough. You know, the community, as you know, was devastated, and the fishing community was devastated by that disaster. And it got me really interested in how to combine kind of mental health and documentary, and also how to help people kind of more in an interactive way with rather than just filming them passively as a sort of fly on the wall, and how to make tools, media tools, which perhaps could give participants a little bit more agency or participation in media. So with my teaching, it's sort of been moving in the direction of VR and XR, mixed reality. And so I thought, well, I better get kind of ahead of the curve a little bit on this if I'm gonna sort of teach film for the longer term. So I started a PhD in film practice, and it's been trying to combine these areas of it's in an anthropology department, but I'm looking at psychotherapy and documentary and mental health.
Wow. So around 2013, you were creating your first documentary. Is that correct?
No, I've been making films since my early 20s, so sort of 25 years, or like
Okay.
I've been making films for a long time, but my that was the final sort of traditional type of documentary I made before beginning to get more interested in kind of interactive media. Yeah.
Got it. So how did that transition from more traditional documentaries happen to interactive media? What was the catalyst for you?
I think it was something around the ethics of it's it's all very well to kind of observe trauma and then share it with an audience, but I felt there was something ethically a little bit, I was a bit skeptical at some point about whether it becomes voyeuristic and where the power lies in the dynamic.
Interesting.
Um, when we're all like that island, Grand Isle was inundated with journalists and filmmakers. It was really unclear to the people living there how these films were going to help them. Um,
Mm,
and I think that really brought the ethics around filmmaking under the kind of under analysis for me a bit more. Um,
interesting.
yeah.
And then, so how does sort of the ethics of having a mental health component in some of your work translate into making it interactive? How does
Yeah.
interactivity perhaps make it more ethical, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I'm new to gaming. I'm new to interactive media, really, compared to probably a lot of the people who'll be interested in your podcasts.
Hmm.
But something that's really struck me is user testing and play testing.
Mm.
It's not something we do in documentary, particularly. I mean, we have some screenings along the way, but we don't really value the user as much as, say, the gaming industry, I think, relies heavily on user testing
Mm.
before releasing their products. So I think giving the power more to the user and giving more autonomy to the user in terms of the design process, I think is a really interesting space in terms of mental health as well, and how to make sure what we did wrong with my research project was we did a sort of waterfall model rather than an agile methodology
Hmm.
for the first sort of avatar test we did. So we developed this avatar over a 6 month period. I show you in a moment the images, and tested it, and it was actually quite unhelpful for the client.
Hmm.
They found it very problematic. Whereas then I began to learn more about the agile methods, which a lot of you guys use when you're designing stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be a lot more efficient financially, but also bring the users along with us on the journey, which feels like much more of a participatory kind of model, which less hierarchical. Yeah, just generally, I feel something which I was more fit with my own kind of ethics a bit better.
Hmm. Right. So playtesting allows the users, it gives more control to the users because they're able to provide feedback about the experience along the way.
Yeah, yeah.
And then this theme of mental health, how did that become an interest for you? Has that always been one of your focuses, or how does mental health play into the PhD work you're doing and your interests?
Yeah, I after the BP oil spill film, I started doing my own psychotherapy because I found it quite, overwhelming spending time in Louisiana.
Right.
And I kept returning in psychotherapy to this, my own kind of story, which I, had never questioned it really. I totally normalized it's what all my family gets sent away to boarding schools.
Mm.
And I got sent back to a boarding school at age 13. I'd grown up in Singapore. But in my own therapy sessions, this kind of bubbled to the surface as a theme because I wasn't sure where home was. I was moving a lot between America and the UK, which is why I went to therapy to sort of talk to a professional about the concept of home.
Mm.
And this project really is about UK boarding schools in particular. So I thought probably with mental health, it's often best to start in your own patch, in your own area, from your own subjective perspective,
Right.
because it's anthropology, the department I'm in, has a not a great legacy of sort of othering and of a kind of colonial legacy.
Hmm.
So I thought, well, we better turn the camera on ourselves, and yeah, that's sort of the starting point for how I linked it to my own
Mm.
story. Yeah.
And just so I can sort of better understand the boarding school setup in the UK, can you share a little bit more about that? What percentage of people from the UK go to boarding schools, or is it usually from a certain age, or how does that all work? I'm sure it
Yeah,
varies, but
I can't think of the overall statistic, I'm afraid, for the nation overall. It's fairly common. A lot of our cabinet in the parliament have attended boarding schools.
hmm,
And the psychotherapist I worked with on this project, Nick Duffel, has written quite a few books on the concept of the wounded leaders is one of his books.
hmm,
And it's about leaders like Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, people who've attended these types of institutions.
Hmm.
And he writes about the type of survival personality, and bullying nature of some of these people, which can dominate when their children are kind of left alone in a sort of Lord of the Flies type environment,
Right.
yeah, without adult supervision.
Right.
And also he writes about normalized neglect, which is how it's normalized in the UK to not have a lot of adults supervising these groups of children who are told it's a privilege to be sent to these schools.
Got it.
And not everyone, maybe about 40%, I think, is a recent statistic of children sent to these schools later kind of lead to connecting it to some of their own mental health struggles.
Oh, wow.
But a lot of children or adults don't find it a problem. So I wouldn't want to kind of say it's across the board. There's a range of different mental health problems that adults later present with around abandonment, unfortunately around abuse, psychological, physical abuse. A lot of addiction behaviors can be connected to it. So there's a range of symptoms, and largely they're called boarding school syndrome by a Professor Joy Shavarian, is the woman who's written the book on boarding school syndrome.
So we have the stages, or we had the component of the boarding schools and the mental health, and well as your experience with storytelling, documentaries, interactive storytelling. It would be super cool to now hear a little bit more about your project and how all of these converged together.
Should we maybe start with showing the trailer, Quentin?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, it's just about a minute, so
Okay.
I'll start screen sharing and then I'll play it. Okay.
All right.
Just go to presenter view.
Do you think any things about being in boarding school have actually affected your health?
I couldn't talk about what was happening to anybody there, and didn't for decades.
Totally lack of duty of care. No duty of care whatsoever.
I think over the years I have suffered from depression. Nobody has ever asked me about boarding school.
Some of us were there for 10 years or something like that, you know. So what's your life like now as this child, you know?
Certainly on the first day, in the first few days, everything just echoed.
I was never one of the children who felt homesick. I think I learned not to feel.
You learn not to feel.
Yeah.
Because the first feeling you shouldn't feel was homesick.
Yeah.
Most of us, in a way, break off parts of ourselves in order to survive. We become complicit in this level of self-betrayal. In a way, that's the terrible thing about it in the end.
Yeah. So Quentin,
cool.
do you have any questions?
I do actually have tons of questions, but so would you like me to ask them now, or maybe would you like to run through the slides and then I can ask them? Or
Yeah, sure. I can run through the slides.
Okay.
So I'll just run through about 10 slides, I think, just to give you guys an overview of the project. So I think I'll just start with this one. So we sort of iterated those figures that you see in the interactive documentary in a group workshops with a art therapist called Tony Gamage, who works a lot with trauma and plasticine. And he works with prisoners, he works with refugees, And he also identifies as a boarding school survivor, someone who himself was sent at a very young age, I think 8 years old, and he found the experience traumatic for a number of reasons. And so he runs these workshops, and we did it all via Zoom during lockdown, and I sent the plasticine to 5 or 6 members of the group, and he ran the workshop with us. And then we moved to a kind of more like realized this depiction of mental health kind of worked quite well with some of the Anthony Gormley type figures. And then Tom Harle, who teaches a VFX course on Unreal and materials courses on YouTube, he iterated, I did a course with him when I was learning Unreal through Escape Studios in London. And Tom came on board as a technical artist for our interactive documentary, which is called Take Me Home. And he iterated this design. So you move through the space and you click on these kind of squiggly figures. And we use that word quite intentionally because it's meant to not intimidate the audience, who are probably a little bit nervous about going back. It's particularly aimed at people who went to boarding school to see if perhaps this could be a tool to help them feel not so alone, like perhaps they're not the only one who had a difficult experience. And we're trying to play test it at the moment with this group to see if it's too photorealistic, the environment, because I'll just switch back to a former slide. What we ended up doing was, when we tried a more photorealistic depiction of the child self, this was an earlier experiment, it got to be a little bit overwhelming for them. I'll actually just show you this slide, because the interesting feedback with the photorealistic avatar was that, yes, it's very uncanny and a bit creepy. And the more photorealistic the avatar was, the higher the client's expectations were of its behavior.
Right.
Yeah. And that just goes back to the reason I've chosen pixel streaming is we were running this first experiment in VR, and they felt blindfolded in the headset and alone in the headset. So that's why we chose pixel streaming, because it felt like it gave a bit of a safer distance between the, it didn't provide such an intense sense of presence. And so just to sum up, we created these 3 spaces, the therapy room, and then the dormitory, and then the entrance hall, which you've already seen. And the main question that we're trying to address with, and why we've arrived at Eagle 3D, is because how can we make playtesting accessible for older players via the web, because they don't have VR. VR is not appropriate for them, as I've explained, and trying to make this experience accessible to more people who don't have high tech at home. And so what we're doing, just to summarize, is we're trying out, a lot of them prefer to watch a playthrough on Vimeo, and about half of them, usually the younger ones, prefer to do the interactive version. And we're trying to find out if it's helpful for different memory retrieval. That's one of our research questions, is if moving physically through the space helps retrieve body-based memories rather than perhaps more aesthetic memories, or there's something about the movement is what we're interested in terms of the gaming, kind of the affordance of being able to move through a 3D space. So I'll leave it there, and
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And thank you for providing that background and overview. Tons of questions for you.
Okay.
So just to kind of set the stage, the age range of the people interacting with this experience, it's quite wide, it seems, younger or older, or what's the rough age range?
I would say mid 40s to mid 70s.
Okay. And most of the people that are interacting with this experience have gone to a boarding school. Is that
Yeah.
fair? And then the research outcomes or the questions that you're trying to answer through this interactive experience, what are some of the questions you're trying to answer?
Yeah, so um, I'm currently trying to decide how ethical it is to show this as an interactive documentary without a psychotherapist present. If someone's watching it alone at home, what are some of the safety implications for that? If it can be quite triggering for some people.
Right.
So I've been doing focus groups where people watch it alone, but they know they're going to be joining a group to talk about it. Because when I've sent it to individuals, they have said they'd rather watch the Vimeo playthrough because they find it a bit scary to be in the space moving through it on their own. One of the things I kind of have a hunch about is they're not used to using the WASD keys to navigate. The arrow keys they're finding easier, but some of the friction for the users is definitely to do with the fact they're not gamers.
Right.
And Ossian Wiley, who's been helping me prepare it for pixel streaming, he, from his years of experience doing this, he's saying perhaps using something like Google Maps, the mechanic of Google Maps, where you have an arrow, point and click, is something more users are familiar with, whereas giving them total freedom to move from character to character to release the audio is perhaps a little bit unusual for this audience who are not gamers. It doesn't come naturally to them.
And then this is sort of the in or not intake, but the introduction. We can either watch the video or do the interactive experience, and then we move on to a group session or individual, something like this.
Yeah. Sorry. I forgot your question was about what are the research questions. Yeah. So the research question is about mnemonic function at the moment, which is memory retrieval, which, as you know, everyone knows is quite common in psychotherapy to try and sort of integrate memories which perhaps recur or problematic memories and try and get them situated in your own present day narrative so that they make a bit more sense and are perhaps less of a kind of recurring problem. So what we're trying to figure out is whether an interactive documentary is a useful tool or even a safe tool to use to retrieve memories. And from anecdotally, what we've noticed is that the people playing the game version who are interacting with it with the on pixel streaming, they actually do begin to think, oh, can I move over the beds? Oh, I wasn't allowed to jump on the beds. Oh, I wasn't allowed to do this. And they're having very different memories to the one people watching on Vimeo. Oh no, the sheets are creased. We were never allowed to have creased sheets. And they're having very different, as one of the Vimeos aesthetically responding, whereas when you're doing more like the gaming version, there's some sort of quite visceral responses coming up and to do with the body-based memories, which is interesting, but also provides more ethical challenges for me, whether I should really be having a more safe space to play test in terms of making sure I don't, trigger anyone. Yeah, so it's a bit of a dilemma at the moment, the play testing. Yeah.
Right. And I know you kind of mentioned this when you're giving your presentation, but just in terms of triggering memories, your decisions are you currently wrestling with it just for the environment for now, how realistic to make it? Because it seems like the more realistic may help trigger memories, but we don't want it to perhaps trigger it in a way that could be traumatic. So how are you kind of wrestling with that right now?
Yeah, so that's exactly why we've ended up pixel streaming, because I chose never to show this in VR to someone who identifies as a boarding school survivor because of the I think, is it called the limbic nerve, which makes you feel as though you're back in the space in terms of the sense of presence, which people like Mel Slater study with exposure therapy, and why VR is so effective for phobias and that type of trauma, or more like event-based trauma. Like Skip Rizzo in California does a lot of work around PTSD and veterans. So it's very effective VR for that type of trauma. But because this is developmental trauma, I wasn't prepared, and doing all the ethics kind of hoops I need to jump through, I didn't feel like it would be helpful to put people literally back into the space, as in an exposure therapy type way. It would not be ethical, which is why we are doing it via pixel streaming, to give people that distance. Yeah.
Right, a layer of separation, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then also it's interesting, so your decision to represent people in the experience, similar to that style that you had shared. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit? Because I think you, through playtesting, realized that perhaps too realistic didn't give the right outcome you were looking for, and then ironically it's easier for people to connect with a more I guess stylized representation. Or what were your thoughts around all of that?
Yeah, definitely. We began working originally at the beginning of the research with a method in psychotherapy called dialoguing with your child self. And in my own therapy, I'd found it quite difficult because you have an empty chair in front of you and you're kind of role playing with this empty chair. And so that was the beginning of the project, was me thinking, well, would it be easier with a visual representation of oneself as a child? Because currently the method in psychotherapy is to bring a photograph of yourself to therapy. This is a particular method that Nick Duffel uses, who's the psychotherapist I worked with. And that's effective as a method. So that it seemed like a no-brainer in a way to try it as the photorealistic avatar. But what happened when we started trying it with our client was that they got the group, we shared it with the group first, and they were like, got obsessed about the teeth and the eyes and the hair. And it was nothing to do with the internal evocation of memory or of connecting back to the vulnerability of that child and perhaps kind of eliciting emotions which might be useful to work through. It all became about the external. And we realized it was a huge distraction. And that actually, as soon as we started working more somatically with the plasticine, it was like they just felt totally liberated and were like, yeah, that's me. And it was like a blob.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was why we decided to go with the abstract figures. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of funny that we can almost associate more with an with an abstract figure rather than something that looks more realistic.
Yes.
Excellent. So now that you kind of have this experience created, can you share sort of what your next steps are, or where you are in the process, or how it's going?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're trying to decide currently whether it's best to use it as a training tool for therapists, or if it goes more ethically, like that would be a better way to sort of place it within the clinical setting. Then I think I'll probably end up sharing it more in that community of therapists. Currently, I'm just playtesting it with boarding school survivors who know a bit more about me and the project, and a kind of there's a bit of a safety net there in terms of they're not going to feel totally isolated trying it out. But I think we're just trying to figure out where to place it in terms of, is it a tool that's useful to kind of introduce people to this subject and to introduce people to the idea that psychotherapy isn't too kind of out there. It's actually quite a useful thing to do and for this client group, and it can sort of help figure out why certain things may be becoming problematic as adults, and whether it's placed more as a kind of stepping stone to therapy. So yeah, we're just trying to figure out where is it going to be useful for this client group.
Well,
so that's why the play testing is so helpful with you guys, because it's very accessible to click on a link and just to get answers to these questions. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're frankly honored to have your project. It's such a cool project, and this is the reason why we wanted to have the platform. So I'm glad that Oz took the time to introduce us, and thank you for using Eagle. We are unfortunately already at the half hour. I know it goes super fast. Any last remarks or comments, or anything else on your mind to share?
No, just when you say Oz, it's Ossian Wiley is the chap who's helped me with prepare it for Eagle 3D, and his company is Wiley and Co. and they're in Bristol. So he's helped me get it ready for Eagle 3D, because we had a packaged Unreal project, and then he got it ready for the platform. But thank you so much. It's always helpful to talk about it, and lovely to chat to you today. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks for dropping by, Juliet. I'm Quentin Anderson. This has been Real Time Talk with Eagle 3D Streaming. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you all on the next show. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.